A routine traffic stop. A power-hungry cop. A woman who refuses to be intimidated. But what happens when the officer realizes she's not just any citizen? The flashing red and blue lights cut through the evening air, casting their glow against the dark pavement. Officer Daniel Williams stepped out of his patrol car, adjusting his belt with an air of authority. Another one, he thought. Another driver who thought they could get away with whatever. He smirked as he approached the black SUV. The window was already rolled down. Inside, a black woman sat calmly, her hands resting on the steering wheel. No panic. No fumbling. Just stillness. Williams tapped the side of the door. License and registration. The woman turned her head slightly, her eyes cool and steady. Can I ask why I was stopped, officer? Williams exhaled sharply, already annoyed. Because I said so. Now, hand over your ID. She moved, slowly. No sudden gestures. Her fingers found her purse, but instead of rushing, she paused, then carefully pulled out her wallet. Williams hated this kind of attitude. He was used to people scrambling, nervous, eager to comply. But she was too controlled. His irritation turned into hostility. Let me guess, he sneered. You're one of those activists, huh? Think you can do whatever you want? Still, no reaction. No fear. Just quiet confidence. Step out of the car, he snapped. She blinked once. Are you sure? Oh, I'm more than sure, he shot back, yanking open the door before she could even unbuckle her seatbelt. A few bystanders had stopped to watch. Someone was recording. But Williams didn't care. He grabbed her arm, turning her toward the SUV, pressing her wrist against the metal. You people think you own the law, huh? Think you're above it? He muttered, smirking. The woman sighed. Officer Williams, she said, her voice calm, almost bored. You really don't want to do this. Williams laughed. Oh yeah? And why's that? She finally handed him the ID. His smirk faded. His face went pale. And at that moment, his entire world collapsed. Officer Daniel Williams stood frozen for a split second, his smirk evaporating as he read the name on the ID in his hand. Dana Carter. His brain struggled to process the gold lettering beneath it. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Chief of Operations. The title hit him like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just some random citizen. This woman outranked every single officer in his precinct, maybe even his own chief. But before he could react, before he could even think about what to say, she tilted her head slightly, watching him with an expression that sent chills down his spine. Now, Officer Williams, Dana said evenly, would you like to explain why you pulled me over? Williams swallowed hard, but the arrogance in him refused to back down completely. Maybe, just maybe, he could still salvage this. Ma'am, I just needed to check your ID, standard procedure, he stammered, his grip tightening around the leather wallet as if that would somehow undo what had just happened. Dana gave him a look that made it clear she wasn't buying it. Standard procedure? Really? She glanced around at the gathering crowd. Then why was I forcibly pulled from my car? Why was I handled like a suspect before you even saw my ID? Williams felt the weight of the people watching, the quiet murmurs, the camera phones recording. His fellow officer, a younger cop named Peterson, had just arrived, walking toward them with a cautious expression. Everything okay here? Peterson asked, eyeing the way Dana was standing, not as a scared civilian, but as a woman fully in control of the situation. Williams forced a chuckle, though it came out strained. Just a misunderstanding. Dana didn't move, didn't flinch. She let the silence stretch, watching him squirm before speaking again. A misunderstanding, she repeated slowly. Tell me, Officer Williams, is it department policy to escalate minor traffic stops into physical confrontations? Williams had no response. His mind raced, looking for an out. But Dana wasn't done. She turned her head slightly toward Peterson. Officer, what was my original offense? Peterson blinked, suddenly unsure how to respond. He hadn't been there for the initial stop. Dana smiled faintly, the kind of smile that wasn't friendly. It was the smile of someone who knew they were about to end someone's career. Exactly. Williams' chest tightened. This was bad. Very bad. He needed control back. Look, Williams took a step forward, trying to reassert his authority. I was just doing my job. Oh, I was just doing my job, okay? People speed around here all the time. I thought you were one of them. Dana raised an eyebrow. Speeding? Is that what you're going with? Williams nodded quickly. Yes, ma'am. She turned, glancing at her SUV, a fully equipped government-issued vehicle. Then, slowly, she pointed to the dash cam mounted on the windshield. Then I assume your radar gun picked up my speed, correct? She asked. Williams felt his stomach drop. He hadn't clocked her speed. He hadn't even checked. The people in the crowd shifted slightly, sensing his discomfort. Someone whispered, "He's screwed." Dana exhaled, as if giving him one last chance to come clean. So, Officer Williams, she said, her voice low and sharp, am I to believe that you, an officer of the law, pulled over an FBI vehicle, illegally detained its occupant, and used unnecessary force, over an unverified speeding violation? Williams' throat felt dry. Dana stepped closer. Let me make this easy for you. Her voice dropped to a near whisper, but every word cut deep. You saw a black woman driving a nice car in the wrong neighborhood, didn't you? And you thought you could intimidate her. Thought you could put her in her place. Williams' jaw clenched. He wanted to deny it, but how could he? The evidence was piling up against him by the second. Peterson took a small step back, distancing himself, sensing that this was about to go nuclear. Do you know what happens when an officer illegally detains a federal agent? Dana asked. Williams barely shook his head. You lose your badge. Silence. Dana finally reached out, taking her ID back from his trembling hands. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, she pulled out her phone. William's heart slammed against his ribs. Who are you calling? He asked, his voice hoarse. Dana's smile returned. This time, there was no kindness in it. Your boss. William's pulse pounded in his ears as Dana Carter casually lifted her phone, scrolling through her contacts with maddening patience. His mind raced, there had to be a way out of this. He could apologize. No, that would make him look weak. He could lie. No, the cameras were rolling. He could threaten her, but no, not now. Not with everyone watching. Peterson shifted uncomfortably beside him, his eyes darting between Williams and Dana, sensing that the situation was spiraling far beyond a simple traffic stop. He had heard of Dana Carter before, not just as an FBI agent, but as the FBI chief. The kind of woman who didn't just enforce the law, she rewrote the rules when necessary. Dana put the phone to her ear. Director Hayes, I need you to pull up the badge number of Officer Daniel Williams, Metro PD, she said, her voice carrying just enough authority for everyone to hear. Yes. Immediately. Williams felt his throat tighten. Ma'am, Dana held up a finger, silencing him without even looking in his direction. No, sir, I'm perfectly fine. But your officer here seems to believe it's his job to detain high-ranking federal officials based on, well, nothing. I assume you'll want to handle this personally. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Several people stepped closer, holding up their phones, some whispering to each other. Yo, she just called the director. This dude is done. That's an FBI badge. Oh, this is about to get real. William's face burned with humiliation. This was not how this was supposed to go. He was the one in control. He was the law on this street. But now, he was a joke. He could already see the headlines forming in his mind: Rogue officer detains FBI chief without cause. Dana ended the call, slipping her phone back into her pocket before finally turning to face Williams again. Now, she said, do you want to tell me again why you pulled me over? Williams swallowed, forcing a fake chuckle. Look, this has clearly gotten out of hand. No need to involve the higher-ups. Let's just call this a misunderstanding and go our separate ways. Dana tilted her head, her expression unreadable. Separate ways? Officer Williams, you laid hands on me. You shoved me against my own vehicle in front of multiple witnesses. You threw around threats as if I were beneath you. Williams clenched his jaw. And now you want me to just walk away? Dana continued, stepping forward. Is that what you tell everyone you do this to? The ones who don't have a badge. The ones who don't have the power to fight back. Williams felt his anger boiling beneath his skin. Listen, lady. Dana took another step toward him, lowering her voice just enough to make sure that only he could hear. Call me lady again, and I'll make sure you don't just lose your badge. You'll be unhireable in every law enforcement agency in the country. Williams' fingers twitched. Peterson took a small step back. The crowd had grown larger now. People were whispering, watching, waiting. The entire block had turned into a courtroom, and Williams was on trial. And then, the worst possible thing happened. A third police car pulled up. The doors swung open, and out stepped Captain Reynolds, Williams' commanding officer. His face was already pale, his jaw clenched as he took in the scene, the people, the cameras, Dana Carter standing completely unharmed while his officer looked like he was about to pass out. Jesus Christ, Reynolds muttered. He stormed forward, his eyes locking onto Williams. What the hell is going on here? Williams struggled to speak. Sir, Dana answered for him. Your officer decided to harass me tonight, Captain. He pulled me over for no reason, escalated the situation without cause, and forcibly detained me before even asking for identification. I assume you'd like to handle this before I file official charges. Reynolds' face drained of color. He turned to Williams, his lips pressed into a thin line. Tell me she's lying, Williams. Tell me you had a valid reason to stop her. Williams opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Reynolds didn't wait for an answer. Instead, he let out a deep breath and pulled out his radio. Dispatch, this is Captain Reynolds. Put Officer Williams on immediate administrative leave. Effective now. The street fell silent. Williams took a step forward, shaking his head. Captain, please, Reynolds didn't even look at him. He turned back to Dana. Ma'am, I sincerely apologize for the actions of my officer tonight. Please know this does not reflect the values of this department. Dana stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she exhaled. Apology noted. But understand this, I will be following up. I will ensure that this isn't just another case of an officer getting a slap on the wrist. Because if I find out that Williams is back in uniform after what happened tonight, it won't be just your department that has a problem, it'll be your entire city." Reynolds nodded stiffly. He understood exactly what she meant. Dana turned to leave. The crowd slowly parted, whispers continuing. But before she stepped into her car, she paused and glanced back at Williams one last time. "Next time you try to abuse your power, Officer Williams, make sure the person you're harassing isn't someone who can destroy your entire career with a single phone call." With that, she shut the door and drove off. Williams stood there, frozen in place. He felt like he was drowning, but there was no water. Just shame. Just the sound of the crowd, some laughing, some shaking their heads, as his career crumbled around him. Williams stood frozen, his ears ringing as the reality of his situation settled in. He had spent his career believing he was untouchable. That his badge gave him unchecked power. But tonight, he had pulled over the wrong person. Dana Carter, FBI Chief of Operations. The crowd was still watching, phones recording, whispers spreading like wildfire. Peterson, the younger officer, looked like he wanted to disappear. Captain Reynolds hadn't moved, his expression unreadable, but the tightening of his jaw told Williams everything he needed to know: this wasn't going away. Dana adjusted the sleeve of her blazer, then turned her full attention to Williams. Unlike him, she wasn't sweating, wasn't shaking. If anything, she looked bored. "You know, Officer Williams, I've seen men like you my entire career. Officers who think their badge is a weapon instead of a responsibility. Officers who believe that respect is something they can force out of people instead of earning it." Williams' mouth opened, then closed. What could he say? That he hadn't known who she was? That if she had just told him from the start, none of this would have happened? Would that even help him now? Dana sighed. "Do you know how many complaints are filed against you every year?" Williams stiffened. 14. The number hit like a bullet. 14 separate reports of excessive force, harassment, and unlawful detainment. All ignored. All swept under the rug by this department. She let her words sink in before adding, "Tell me, Captain Reynolds, do you still think this is a simple misunderstanding?" Reynolds, to his credit, didn't try to defend his officer. "Ma'am, I won't make excuses. I take full responsibility for what happened here tonight." Dana let out a quiet chuckle, shaking her head. "Full responsibility? So what happens next? You suspend him with pay? Reassign him to a different precinct so he can start the cycle all over again?" Reynolds hesitated. That was what usually happened. Officers like Williams didn't get fired, they got relocated. A few months of desk duty, maybe some retraining, and then back on the streets. Dana took a step closer, her presence somehow making Williams feel small. "Let's be honest here. If I had been just another black woman on the road tonight, no badge, no title, how would this have ended?" Silence. Everyone knew the answer. Dana inhaled sharply, then turned to the crowd. "How many of you have had encounters with this officer before?" A few hands went up. Some reluctantly, some immediately. One man, standing near the front, called out, "He stopped me last year for acting suspicious in my own neighborhood." A woman beside him nodded. "He followed me home from work once. Pulled me over in my own driveway." More voices joined in. The stories poured out like floodgates had been opened. Dana listened. She had expected this. She had seen it in too many cities, too many departments. Williams, however, hadn't expected it at all. He turned, scanning the faces around him. These were people he had pulled over, people he had detained, people he had terrorized, and now they had power over him. His badge wasn't a shield anymore. It was a target. Dana turned back to Reynolds. "Do you still think he deserves that badge?" Reynolds' throat bobbed as he swallowed. He hated that this was happening in public. But there was no way out of this now. "Officer Williams," Reynolds said, his voice steady, "effective immediately, you are placed on unpaid suspension pending an internal investigation." The crowd erupted. Some cheered. Others muttered that it wasn't enough. Williams snapped. "This is bullsh. Shut up." Dana's voice cut through the noise like a blade. Everyone fell silent. Williams turned to her, eyes burning with hatred. "I will personally oversee your investigation," Dana continued, her tone calm but razor-sharp. "And I will make sure that for once, an officer like you faces real consequences. Because let me tell you something, Williams," she stepped closer, so close he could see his own reflection in her eyes. "This department might have protected you before. But tonight? Every single one of your actions was caught on camera. By me. By them. By half the damn city." Williams' breathing grew erratic. "There will be no cover-up. No slap on the wrist. No misconduct training. You're done." His hands balled into fists. But he couldn't do a damn thing about it. Reynolds gestured toward Peterson. "Get him out of here." Peterson hesitated, then stepped forward, placing a firm grip on Williams' shoulder. "Let's go," he muttered. Williams jerked away, but he had no choice. He turned back once more, staring at Dana with something between fury and fear. She didn't even acknowledge him. As Williams was led away, Dana looked back at Reynolds. "You have a problem in your department, Captain. I suggest you start fixing it before I have to come back." Reynolds gave her a stiff nod. Dana turned, walked to her car, and slid into the driver's seat. As she started the engine, she glanced at the crowd one last time. Some people waved. Some just watched. And just like that, she was gone. But the damage was done. Williams' career was over. His name would be plastered across the news, his actions dissected and condemned. The department would be forced to make real changes, whether it wanted to or not. And for once, justice had been served. The next morning, the city woke up to headlines that would shake the department to its core. Officer suspended after illegally detaining FBI chief. Rogue cop exposed, racial profiling caught on camera. Corrupt officer finally faces justice, but will it stick? William sat alone in his apartment, his phone buzzing non-stop with messages, from colleagues, reporters, and even distant family members who suddenly wanted nothing to do with him. He didn't answer any of them. The department issued a statement within hours. "We take all allegations of misconduct seriously and are conducting a full investigation into Officer Williams' actions. We will not tolerate abuse of power within our ranks." But Williams knew what that really meant. They weren't protecting him anymore. He had gone too far, embarrassed the department at the highest level. He wasn't an asset anymore, he was a liability. And soon, the inevitable happened. His badge was revoked. Not just a suspension. Not just a reassignment. Terminated. Meanwhile, across town, Captain Reynolds sat at his desk, rubbing his temples as he stared at the growing list of complaints being reopened. Williams wasn't the only problem. His precinct was under scrutiny now. And Dana Carter had made it clear, she was watching. At FBI headquarters, Dana reviewed a final report before closing her laptop. Her job here wasn't done. One corrupt cop had been dealt with, but the system that allowed him to operate still needed fixing. And she wasn't about to let that slide. She leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. This time, justice had been served. But the fight was far from over. As for Williams, his career in law enforcement was over. No other department would take him, not with this level of exposure. His power was gone. His authority stripped away. And for the first time in his life, he was the one who had to feel powerless. Dana Carter had seen men like Officer Williams before. Too many times. Some of them learned their lesson. Most of them didn't. But for once, the system had worked the way it was supposed to. The footage of the incident went viral. It wasn't just local news, it was national. Talk shows debated it. Civil rights activists praised Dana for standing her ground. Even government officials made statements about the need for reform. The pressure on the police department grew by the hour. More complaints against Williams were re-examined. Cases that had been ignored were suddenly being taken seriously. Internal affairs swept through the precinct, uncovering more misconduct. Williams wasn't just fired. He was blacklisted. His certification revoked. No law enforcement agency would touch him. No security firm would hire him. He had gone from being the man in power to the man no one wanted to be associated with. Meanwhile, Dana returned to her work. She wasn't satisfied yet. One officer being fired wasn't enough. She pushed for mandatory body cameras, for real accountability measures, for officers like Williams to be weeded out before they ever got a badge. At a press conference, a reporter asked, "Ms. Carter, do you think justice was served?" She paused for a moment, then answered. Justice isn't about one bad officer losing his job. It's about making sure there aren't 10 more just like him taking his place. The crowd fell silent. They knew she was right. The department announced sweeping changes in the weeks that followed. New training. New oversight committees. The public had spoken, and this time, they hadn't been ignored. And Williams? For the first time in his life, he knew what it felt like to have no power. No badge. No authority. No respect. He was just another man, one who finally had to answer for his actions. This wasn't just about one bad cop. It never is. Officer Williams may have lost his badge, but how many others like him are still out there? How many times does this happen to someone without a badge to protect them? Without a camera recording? Without an FBI chief on the receiving end? Dana Carter stood her ground because she had power. But what happens when the person being harassed doesn't? That's the real question. How many times have we seen people pulled over, mistreated, or even worse, because of who they are and what they look like? And how many times has justice not been served? This story had a satisfying ending, but only because the right person was in the wrong place at the wrong time. But what if she hadn't been? Would the story have been different? Would Williams have walked away without consequence? Would Dana have been another nameless victim of abuse of power? Now, here's the part where we ask you. What do you think? Should Officer Williams face criminal charges for what he did? Should the entire precinct be investigated? Or was justice already served? Let us know in the comments. Your voice matters. And if you believe stories like this need to be heard, hit that like button and subscribe. Because the more we talk about injustice, the harder it is for people like Williams to get away with it. Until next time, stay aware, stay informed, and keep holding power accountable.